African countries are experiencing severe debt troubles, with several governments having to sacrifice social spending to pay back creditors. Take Ghana, for example. At the start of the 2010s, the government was spending more of its budget on health and education, seen here in the light and dark blue lines. But after the government borrowed money on the markets, the interest payment burden began to grow. That's the red line gradually rising, falling, and then spiking. Now, the largest share of Africa's debt, that's almost half of it, is owed to Western private creditors who tend to charge African countries higher interest rates. On the chart that you see, with the light blue bars, that Africa and the European Union have the same level of debt as a share of GDP. The stark difference is with the dark blue columns, where you see African countries, on average, spend 17% of their annual budgets paying interest on debt compared to just 3% for the EU. This has led to growing calls for reform of the international financial architecture. And recently in Ghana, Pan-African activists protested in the capital, Accra, to put pressure on international financial institutions. Thousands of demonstrators marched through the streets, calling for the cancellation of Africa's debt and for systemic failures in international lending to be addressed. They say a solution is needed to provide immediate debt relief to economies under huge debt and to bring about structural reforms that prevent future crises.
When we get money, it goes to people whom we are owing. So we are not able to build schools. We are not able to service our children. We are not able to increase salaries of workers. So workers today, we are not fighting for anything around salary. We are only calling for global debt cancellation for African governments and African countries. We are tired.
Somalia has had a very, dangerous debt trap for decades. What we are demanding is we no longer need a new borrowing, a new debt. We do not want to go back to that same hole.
The cancellation of the debt will put us on a starting point, because right now Africa is at crossroads. So it will enable us to go back to the drawing board and to replan, re-strategize, and reconfigure. What debt do we want? How do we want it? How do we monitor it, and what will be its results?
We don't want any debts tied to us, and our future generations need to be debt-free. So cancel those debts. Thank you.
So Pan-African activists calling for Africa's debt to be cancelled, but is it that simple? To talk more about Africa's debt dilemma, we've invited Nzioka Waita onto the program. He is Managing Director for Africa at the Tony Blair Institute, which published a paper this year titled A New Debt Deal for Africa, Breaking the Vicious Cycle. Welcome to DW News Africa, Mr. Waita. Why don't we begin with how we got here? Why are so many African countries either in or very close to being in debt distress?
Well, let's just say sort of 5 reasons. One is during the 2010s, lots of governments, very ambitious, elections all around the continent, bringing in a new set of leaders, a youthful population, highly connected, demanding to see progress and development. And as a consequence, governments borrowing to bridge the infrastructure gap. Cash was in large supply from across the world, multilateral, bilateral, and commercial money was easily available to finance primarily infrastructure programs across the continent. Now, high cost of borrowing, that money cost a lot of money. Then 2, some of these governments, public finance architecture was very weak, so the ability to account for money that is borrowed and ensure that it's utilized for the appropriate purposes. 3 was you can't live on bread alone, so even as you borrow money, countries need to be able to generate their own income. Tax mobilization or domestic revenue mobilization, very weak in a number of countries across the continent. Then 3, external shocks. War in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, crash of oil across the world, increase of oil across the world, adversities of climate change, and then the mother of all, COVID pandemic, which really put Africa into a tailspin. So a lot of these things combined to make a very unfortunate situation. And then, of course, just poor debt management in terms of relationships with multilaterals across the world.
Right. Why don't we take a listen to recent remarks made by Ghana's finance minister, and we'll pick up from there.
The African countries borrow so expensive as compared to its peers in other parts of the world. Why should it be? Why should the risk premium for African countries be so different from Europe, America, and other parts of the world? Why should that be?
So here you have Ghana's finance minister asking the question about why Africa pays such high interest rates. Private sector lenders, as we know, charge African countries higher interest rates. Is that justified?
Well, for starters, it's true. It's a fact, you know. On average, African countries borrow at north of 10% from multilateral institutions, public debt, from commercial debt. It can even be up to 30%. By comparison, within the EU and G7 countries, some of them are borrowing at 3%. So you can see the huge disparities. Now, some of this is driven by what we call negative risk perception. Now, in some instances, it's pure perception. In other cases, it is the reality. But the perception seems to have carried the day, much to the detriment of the global south.
And now there's been a lot of talk about debt restructuring for Africa. What is the goal of this debt restructuring, and what progress has been made in this regard?
Well, the international finance system, as we know it, is fundamentally broken. If you look at the countries that are in debt distress or near debt distress, so far it is only Ghana and Zambia that have managed to go through extremely painful debt restructuring conversations within what we call the G20 common framework, which basically means, number one, sit with multilateral institutions like IMF, World Bank, and others. Then two, sit down with bilateral lenders. So if you borrowed from France or from China or from the European Union or some other bilateral, Japan as a case in point, you sit and negotiate with them. Now, the more complex bit is commercial lenders, private sector lenders, people who have a profit imperative. They're not in the business of development for development's sake. They lend you money because they expect to make a return on it. Now, trying to get all these people to agree to take a haircut, as in take a reduction or cancellation of the money that you owe them, is not the easiest thing. And geopolitics comes into play in a very big way. So, for example, if you're sitting with a group of lenders that are largely Western, they will agree to, they might want to agree to restructure the debt, maybe take less or increase the time that you have to pay back the amounts that borrowed. But they won't do so unless lenders like China equally agree to the same terms, because they will not give you headroom by reducing what you owe them so that you can pay off debts owed to countries that they consider to be not aligned to their way of thinking. You know, and this is more like an East-West situation, and African countries get caught in the middle.
Right, Nzioka Waita from the Tony Blair Institute. Thanks very much. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.